Hello, thank you for joining us for a prelude to the final program on the Maryland Symphony Orchestra's reimagined 2020-2021 season of concerts. We are so honored to have with us for this program the composer and pianist Michael Brown. On our program are two concertos, one by Mr. Brown and one by Ludwig van Beethoven. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael Brown to the conversation because we have a lot to talk about. Michael, this will be your third appearance with the Maryland Symphony. You are one of our beloved colleagues and one of our most beloved collaborators. I know that the orchestra absolutely enjoys working with you, and our audiences have been thrilled by your performances of Beethoven and Shostakovich and Brahms in the past, and also Brown, because I'm very proud to say, and I'm also grateful to you, that your first appearance with us was actually doing double duty, playing, well, was it triple duty? It was triple duty. You played on every work on the program. We presented an early work of yours for piano and orchestra, which at that time was called Concerto. It was a one movement piece. Mm-hmm. And then you played Beethoven's first piano concerto. Mm-hmm. And then you also played the very extensive piano part in Shostakovich's First Symphony, one of my favorite symphonies of all time. So thank you. And then you came back and we did Brahms together, and oh my goodness, that was quite a glorious experience as well. And now we're very excited to have you back with us and our opportunity to be what I believe is the second performance, live performance of your new concerto that you've written in honor of Beethoven's 250th anniversary of birth. But of course, the COVID pandemic has taken away that year pretty much from all orchestras. And so now we're making up for lost time. So welcome. And I am so excited. I have to say, I watched the premiere performance of your concerto with the Kalamazoo Symphony, which happened, I believe, just a few weeks ago. And it was such a pleasure to see that wonderful orchestra with their conductor, Julian Quarty, who I know, and also to watch you and to watch you bring to life your own music. Can you tell us a little bit about what our audiences are going to be hearing, your experience in the premiere, and what you're looking forward to in the second performance?
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm so happy to be with you today and to be coming back very soon to one of my favorite orchestras. I've always loved collaborating with the Maryland Symphony and the Brahms and the Shostakovich, and I can't wait for this program, which is very special for me because it's two pieces that I feel very personal about. One, because I wrote it, my own concerto, and the Beethoven Third Piano Concerto, which is pretty much the work that inspired it. My own concerto. So to put them together feels very special and personal, and we can delve deeper into that throughout this conversation. But yes, the piece has been it's had quite an evolution and quite a journey. Of course, life has been completely interrupted for the last 14 months or so. So it's had even more of an interesting story, but the piece really goes back 3 or so years when I started writing it. And I spent some time in 2019 living in Aaron Copland's. I was doing a Copland residency program where I was actually living in the house where Copland lived the last 30 years of his life. And I was working for a few weeks, a few months in his music studio and sleeping in his bed and making coffee in his kitchen and all that stuff. And I was working on this piece you're going to hear in Copland's house. And I would have scores of Beethoven's piano concertos all over Copland's desk. I'd be studying them and annotating them and playing through them and getting to really understand how Beethoven constructs the material. And that really went into the fabric of how I wrote my concerto, which doesn't sound like Beethoven, but takes the kind of idea of building from these little tiny cells, these what we call motivic fragments of one little idea that you hear, let's say in the Fifth Symphony, da 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 da, a very something that pervades the entire work. So he does that Beethoven in throughout his compositional output, and especially in the piano concertos. And I've been fortunate to play the first concerto with you and these concertos several times. So they start to feel like old friends. And I wanted to write a piece that incorporates a lot of my sort of love and knowledge about these Beethoven concertos, but have my own spin on the form of a concerto. And I set it for piano and string orchestra. And it's had quite a journey throughout the pandemic, with many postponements and cancellations, as one would expect. But I've been thinking recently that has actually given me a gift. I mean, a great time with a lot of this extra time to keep delving deeper into the work, revising the work, exploring the work, and sitting with it. Because often you're writing up to the last minute, you're doing something, and then you just do it. You have to just go. And what this did was, oh, that was canceled. I have made, who knows how long I have, 12 months. And I kept playing with it, and I kept exploring it, and I kept tinkering with the piano part and the string parts, and asking my string player friends about the harmonics and getting advice. So as a composer, we would say the ink is still wet, although I work on the computer, so it's not ink. But the piece has certainly evolved and will probably continue to evolve throughout our process together, because I'm so interested in your input and your take on it. And I really believe that the piece is not just, here's the piece, let's do it. The piece is what we create together with me and you and the orchestra, and it's a collection. So I'm excited to, dive in with you on this journey.
Well, me too. As you can imagine, I have been, the minute you sent me the score, which was an early rendition of the score, and then you sent a further, well, I would say it's not the second edition. It's like, I don't know how many, but it's the most recent. So now I've been delving into that and seeing the minor but important changes that you've made. I am just intrigued by it completely. Of course, I see the connections and hear the connections of Beethoven. I know that you have a special relationship to Beethoven because you've played his music so much. I have an obsession with Beethoven, and feel very honored to have at least conducted all of his symphonies at least once, and all of his piano concertos. The third, and we'll talk about the third Beethoven piano concerto later, which happens to be my personal favorite, even though as a philosophy major in college, I should probably go toward the fourth for its sort of metaphysical second movement or whatever. But the third just delights me and enthralls me in ways we encounter Beethoven as a young man, not yet suffering. And his brilliance is just on full display in that piece. Now, thank God you don't have to suffer, Michael. Not in these ways, but you are in the full flourish of your career and of your ability. And so this is a marvelous new, for me, experience of your work, because of course I remember the first piece you wrote for us. We're very proud that we were part of that, making that first piece happen for you. And I'm even more proud to be able to say that the piece that we commissioned for last year will be presented next season. And that is a piece without a piano solo.
That's right.
At least without you being the soloist, and it's not a concerto. So I can't wait to be able to bring you to Maryland as the composer in your role as a composer. But this is a wonderful opportunity for us to get to know you again, be reacquainted with you, of course, as a magnificent pianist, but also as a great composer. So the first movement, Sonata Form, of course, that was, you mentioned in your program notes to the piece, which can be found online and which we will have available as well on our site. You followed suit to Beethoven's structure, basic outline of a concerto, a 3-movement work, fast, slow, fast. Mm-hmm. Knowing you personally, I hear your impish sense of humor in the third movement, the rondo. There's a lot of chasing and back and forth with the orchestra, mixing the meters, going four square, galumphing around instead of dancing at moments. And that is so Beethoven. Beethoven did that kind of thing too. He loved to play jokes. Sometimes I don't know how the audience took it, but as a musician watching and looking at the score and playing it, it's just a lot of fun. It's guffaw inducing. So congratulations on that, because I think if you can't laugh in music, at least sometimes, you know, what is life worth living without some laughter, right? Something like that. First movement, motivic. Immediately we hear the motives, the important statements that will be brought forth. And may I also say, when you the first piece that you played, that you wrote and we performed with you, you had been immersed in Ravel, and I heard effects of Ravel going on in that piece. And I definitely am intrigued by how you are able to evoke, well, to have a conversation with a composer in the past, their works, and yet not sound derivative. I know that is not your intention at all. Not sound derivative, but literally be conversing and saying, well, let's take this idea and let's see where else it might go. I think that's what you're doing. I think that's how you're you know. And also, I do have to say, I hear a lot of Copland in at moments, especially one moment where you write in the score declamatory, because that's such a 1940s American, fanfare for the common man kind of declarations of great truths and things like that. So obviously the spirit of Copland was informing your composition as well as the great Beethoven. So I've given you lots to talk about, and so I leave it to you.
That's true. Well, it's, living in this house, and Copland has always been an idol for me, and that whole school of American composers, of Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, have really, I would say, infused their way into my compositional, let's say, arsenal to draw upon. I appreciate your derivative comment, because that's something I think a lot about as a composer, and especially these days, I feel that the pandemic and just living and playing and breathing, I feel like my music and maybe my piano playing is changing and evolving, and just forming new things I'm excited about and embracing new things, and that feels like an exciting path to explore. Sometimes it's hard to put these things into words as a composer, but I feel like this piece is a real that this is a very important piece in my life as a pianist. The piano concerto is perhaps one of the most important genres that we have. To put a piano in front of an orchestra, to be the literature, like we've talked about Beethoven, but it comes from before Beethoven. It comes from Mozart, and who wrote 27 piano concertos, and Haydn. And the legacy is intimidating of the genre, with so many great concertos being written. Why write another one? But I've been fortunate to have many opportunities to play various concerti in my life, and I love it. It's different from solo, and it's different from chamber music. There's sort of my part, or the solo part. There's your part. There's your interpretation. It's a very interesting balance of opinions and artistic sensibilities. So it's always fun to kind of chisel down that process before a performance with an orchestra. And so it's daunting. It's a daunting task to write a concerto. I felt at times in over my head, and I felt that being in that house away from, I had them remove the Wi-Fi. I really didn't want to be in touch with anybody. And I had Copland's landline. That's what I had. But aside from that, I really needed that space to really explore and keep exploring and rewrite and consistently tinker and change my mind. And so you mentioned the first movement. So basically, that's right. The piece is in 3 movements, and each movement adheres to pretty much a very similar structure that Beethoven employs in each of his piano concertos, which is that the first movement is the longest. It has what we call sonata form, which is an exposition of ideas where you hear the main ideas, you hear them developed, you hear them come back. There's a big piano cadenza, and there's a coda. And that's exactly what Beethoven does in the third concerto. You hear the orchestra play the main idea, then the pianist comes in with the tune, you hear a second theme, you hear a development, a recap, a cadenza, where the pianist can show off, and then a coda. And it's exactly the same structure as the Beethoven third. But in this case, I actually started writing the slow movement first. The idea of my concerto, I started with the slow movement because I had an idea. Because Beethoven was so revolutionary. The piano as an instrument, I can tell you a little bit about this piano later, but the piano itself as an instrument was really coming of age in Beethoven's life. It was not a fully formed instrument around 1800 when the third concerto was written. It was still evolving, and rapidly and very quickly throughout Beethoven's lifetime, the piano really evolved from these harpsichord to forte piano to piano to later on the metal frames. They could project more to a hall, to the Franz Liszt era. So it really becomes a concert instrument with projection power. And then the piano, the modern concert grand, pretty much settled in the late 19th century, which is when this piano is from, until today. There's been very little changed in the mechanism. I'm talking of obviously different piano makers change different things, but I'm talking generally speaking. That from the 19th century to now, the piano has changed very little comparatively to during Beethoven's lifetime. So it really came in on its own as a concerto soloist that could, solo instrument that could sustain in front of an orchestra and become a real solo instrument. Beethoven was a great pianist and was very familiar with Mozart concerti, and Beethoven's third concerto, you might say, is influenced directly by Mozart's C minor concerto, but we can talk more about Beethoven later. But what I want to talk about is my slow movement, which started with the idea that Beethoven was pretty much the first composer to be so particular in marking pedal markings for the solo pianist. He puts in the score often these long open pedals that are somewhat ambiguous. Are you supposed to do that? Are you supposed to play in the third concerto? This is how the pedal, if you actually do what he says on the modern piano, only there does he change the pedal. So all that it sounds pretty revolutionary to me with the overtones of the piano and the sonority. Now, I don't think that one should play it quite like that, but I think the idea of that, the sound bleed and those things is so wonderful and so different and revolutionary. And it was that concept that I wanted to embrace in my concerto. That was the first idea I had with my concerto, which was to embrace the idea of these long pedal markings. So what I did was I took all of the same pitches of that phrase and wrote my own idea, which starts the slow movement as a piano solo. That's the piano is alone in the Beethoven third, and this is mine with the pedal down. orchestra comes in there. So that's a little bit of a sort of the way I introduce the slow movement, which is directly inspired by Beethoven and these concept of long pedal markings and letting the overtones and the strings and the pedal just meshed and blend together. And it's one of the things I love about the instrument of the piano, and I think Beethoven must have loved it too, because he
Clearly.
in many of his piano sonatas, and he's always being very specific. I don't know a composer around that time that was as specific.
And just for anyone who is wondering about pedals, the pedal is to sustain the sound, to give a line to what is a percussive instrument where the sound decays immediately. So the pedal helps enhance sustaining sound. And so to have that blur, or I wouldn't call it a schmear, but a blur of the overtones, and it gives a great effect. And I love that you are able to. I hear your conversation with Mr. Beethoven, but it's not only in the using all the notes of the harmony. It's also using some of the rhythmic repetition of the same note. Mozart did that a lot too, I have to say. I mean, Papageno, but but there was something so poetic about the slow movements of Beethoven. I know that that's been talked to death in terms of his adagios are, profound. And we will talk about this concerto, which I think the second movement is one of the most glorious pieces of all time, and one of his most beautiful melodies. And you have answered in your language with one of your most beautiful melodies in the concerto too. It's one that's, all of a sudden you're just like, ah, and we just heard it, and it's really beautiful. It's very heartfelt, and I can't help but think it's in direct conversation with Mr. Beethoven. Oh. I think he'd be very impressed that you caught all that, because I'm not sure other people even discuss that. I think they're worried about, as a pianist, you're worried technically about clarity and about, his piano was earlier, so it did a different thing with the pedal, and with the bigger piano, there's much more overtone and all of that kind of thing. So you're trying to get clarity, but as a composer, you're experiencing all the sounds, everything that's happening, not just necessarily the melody and the accompaniment, but what that is together, and what that is compositionally too, structurally. That's a different kind of hearing than people who are encountering a piece. They're looking for something to hold on to, a melody and accompaniment, because that's the rhetoric of the old days. And right. You're stretching that. You're stretching our ears to something new, which is really great. Yeah, that second movement is glorious. Your second movement, and then your third movement is quite cheeky as far as I'm concerned. Although there is the fierceness of Beethoven. Beethoven, even as I don't think he was losing his hearing, or at least he wasn't suffering about it in 1800. He was somewhat of a dandy, and he was making his life not so much as a composer, but as a performer at that point. Right. There's some pretty handsome pictures of him at that time. I mean, he cared about what he looked like and all those things. And I do agree that his music does look back to the C minor of Mozart's famous C minor concerto. But there's a humor that he has that it's not Haydn's humor, it's not Mozart's humor, it's his own kind of special thing, and he loves to play tricks with the conversation. He's involved in making conversation happen, as you are. And so in this third movement, if you want to talk about it a little bit, it's a rondo movement. So there are sections that come back over and over again, and that sort of hold the piece together with journeys away from it and then return. So if you can talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
I was very struck when I studied all 5 of the Beethoven concertos in my life, but also in preparation for writing this piece, or simultaneously while writing this piece. I was really struck by the rondo form, how strict he is to embrace the rondo form in each of those 5 concertos, how you have an idea and it keeps coming back. and it keeps, sometimes it's varied, sometimes it's exactly the same. Sometimes the soloist plays it, sometimes the orchestra plays it, and it's that humorous conversation that you mentioned that is exactly what I wanted to play off of with this Rondo Finale. It happens to be in 6/8, which Beethoven uses a lot, and it starts like this with the piano. And then the orchestra comes in, and I can't play it because I can't play the 5 parts, but basically embracing that repeated note thing, which is actually much more idiomatic, we would say, for string players, this kind of a bowed technique than it is as a solo on the piano. It's not as easy on the piano, but that was my idea, to kind of play these themes off of each other, have the piano introduce the idea, and then have the orchestra play it, and then that I play throughout the entire movement with that, and there's contrasting material and second themes. There's one moment that where I play with in the high register with the double bass, with the solo double bass alone.
Yeah, it's crazy great.
The music kind of just stops, and
loved it.
I was trying to do something different and humorous, where we kind of
it works.
We play.
I don't know if we should give it away. I don't think we should give it away because it's just such a great moment.
We're not talking about it. But the piece goes on and on. The piano is very much against the orchestra in this movement. I think it's very much we're fighting with each other. It's a conversational, argumentative at times. It doesn't have much sweetness in the last movement, but it has, I think, that kind of intensity and drive, pretty much from start to finish, with a tiny little cadenzas, all these things that were plays off of the classical style, I would say.
For sure.
And I wanted to give it, a big roaring, ending. Maybe we shouldn't give it away. Maybe you're right.
It's so much fun, and it's a tour de force for orchestra as well. I mean, they have their work cut out for them, and that movement is particularly. I'd like to, if you don't mind, could we let's go back to the first movement, and then we can move into Beethoven's
Right.
Concerto,
Yes.
because
Yes.
in some ways we didn't quite talk about the great declamatory idea of the first
Yes.
movement. I mean, you certainly described it. I will say this: the introduction by the orchestra is far shorter than the one in Beethoven's Concerto, which is practically symphonic, right? Which is just like 10 minutes of orchestra, and then finally you come in with the theme again. In some ways, that idea slowly moved out of his, because I think, is it the fourth symphony, fourth concerto that he begins the piano? He just says, "Sorry, orchestra, I've got my idea. Here we go."
That's right.
So that's different. But the third is still a little bit back in the 18th century, with the orchestra giving the whole theme. We, as an orchestra, we get to do some of that, of course. But then when the piano comes in again, it's quite momentous. And could you play the motive, the big argument that we are going to grapple with?
The orchestra starts the piece with this tune, and then shortly thereafter, not as long as Beethoven, you said, I commit. And it continues and continues like that. Can I show another little place, actually?
Love it.
While we're just doing this, there's in the Beethoven. I mean, I have some of these pretty. See, I don't want to give away my little things, but there's one moment. There's one moment in the Beethoven Concerto where Yes, right after the main tune, which is so after all that, the orchestra plays. That's how the piano comes in. And it goes to E flat. That's in the Beethoven. In my concerto, I have a pretty direct spin off of that. So that's pretty much a direct quote. I don't do that throughout my mirroring of Beethoven, but in this case, I have the orchestra presents an idea, and I come in with this Beethoven.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe his is more beautiful. I don't know, but it's a different piece.
Different piece and wonderful. It does the same thing. It's conversation. It's chamber music. It's engaging. It's engaging the ear, engaging the players, and that's exactly what your work does as well. We're really looking forward to performing it, and I know our listeners will be enjoying it as well. Now, before we get to the Beethoven, I have to mention something that I'm watching as you play. I see something. Maybe you sustained an injury or something going on in your, I think, your right hand. Are you okay?
Yeah. Oh, I'm
Will
fine.
You be ready to play with us?
Absolutely. I'm totally fine. Sometimes in life we use our hands for lots of mundane things like, doing laundry. But anyway, my finger is totally fine. I have to wear this thing. So if you see this, you can just imagine it's some kind of jewelry or something, but it doesn't, it's not a big deal. Yeah.
Great. That's great. Great news.
It only makes Beethoven and my piece slightly harder, but that's okay. So.
Well, I'm glad you're okay. So let's move on to then the second half of our program, which is the great C minor, the third piano concerto of Beethoven, written in, as you said, around 1800. My goodness, he's a young man for sure. A brilliant pianist, not heading toward the direction, not knowing the direction his life is going to take. And we have to encounter it. I think it's important to both know his history, but also encounter the piece, know when it was written and what's going on in 1800 in some ways. It's quite different than even 4 to 12 years later. We don't have Napoleon yet. I mean, a lot of things haven't happened. Just a few years later, Napoleon will happen, and the Eroica Symphony is going to happen, and then life changes forever. The C minor piano concerto, there's a lot of you can almost begin to hear the motive of the C minor symphony happening. So you can see how he uses his motives, even though that perhaps, as you said, comes from Mozart and those repeated notes. You have gestures of fanfare because the military is always part of the 19th century and the 18th century because of the connection of the symphony or of musicians in general to armies and to royalty. And so fanfares and marches and all of those things that accompany that lifestyle were part of the rhetoric of the music. So you get that there's a grandeur in the third concerto. There's a bit of artifice in the concerto. There's a little bit of, standing slightly back, although he can't help but want to engage his listener. He is so much about communication, which is so, I think his deafness must have made that even more poignant, but we don't have to talk about that now because it's not happening in this concerto. And then the second movement for me personally is one of the most beautiful melodies he ever wrote. Once it's given to the orchestra and the flute soars above, you just shake your head at how did you do that? Because we know that it's hard for Beethoven to give in to melody. It's not that he couldn't do it. It's just that he's so involved in his compositional technique with the small motives and things that are organic, but not necessarily, beauty is not necessarily on top of mind for him. Function, communication, truth, frankness, brusqueness sometimes. So when something like this comes, it's just breathtaking. Last movement, of course, is wonderfully, it's not quite cheeky this time. It's brilliant. It's a brilliant rondo, I would say. And it's got some Hungarian things going on a little bit in its accompaniment, I would say. So, but those are my takes on one of my most beloved works, which is why I was so thrilled when I realized that your concerto had so much conversation with the piece and how perfect it was, even though we were going to, when we could have a full orchestra, present your new work that we commissioned. We'll hear that later on next season, but here, this direct relationship between the two concerti, the conversation that our listeners are going to have is very exciting. So now I hand it over to you to discuss this great concerto of Beethoven.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a work that has tremendous importance for me, and it's one that I've been fortunate to play a fair amount of times over the last, let's say, 10 years or so. And each time I come back to it, it's again layered into the fabric, is so much that you learn and discover. And I find that is one of the great thrills of being a musician, being a pianist, is to uncover and to deepen your understanding of the music. And this work, especially because we just talked about my concerto, but this was, I had the score open throughout most of the composing process of my own concerto. So it's a piece that I have been able to look at from multiple angles. I've been able to sit for 6 hours a day and slave over the difficulty of it, of which is immense and revolutionary in the way that Beethoven wrote for the piano. And I've also looked at it from the angle of, how did he do that? How did he put the chords together there, and this rhythmic motive, and that comes back there, and this is introduced there, and this is put in the flutes, and all that stuff. But like you said, it begins with this immense orchestral introduction with a very haunting theme.
Very operatic, isn't very opera-like. There's a drama going on here.
That's right.
Clearly, his head is Mozart operas or whatever operas are going on. Rossini isn't quite there yet, but you know what I mean. It's just there's something dramatic going on, and what a way to start softly rather than, mystery.
Yeah, and ghostly, and this idea. I mean, it's not that complicated in a way. It's basically a C minor chord and a scale, and then this rhythmic thing. That rhythm is extremely important in the entire first movement. Bum, ba bum, ba ba. He does that all over.
It's like a heartbeat, isn't it? It's almost like a heartbeat.
That's right. Yeah. Right before. After the development, the orchestra. And it all comes, and that's what's the genius of Beethoven. It all comes from the first 10 seconds of music. You get
exactly right.
Everything.
It's a miracle.
He tells you so much. As a composer, you could spend the afternoon just studying those first 4 measures and seeing what he gets out of those 4 measures. It's amazing. He starts with these. That's what I was saying. These tiny cells. And the whole 30 or 35-minute concerto or so really comes out of that idea, the rhythmic stuff, the idea of the intervals, and that's the genius of Beethoven. He goes later into the key of E flat.
And that changes the world again. It just opens up the skies when he does that. He's a master of understanding how harmony can
That's right.
Be a variation in itself. I mean, how it can absolutely change your whole outlook, the way you encounter the music. It's really something. the other thing that you caught, and I will say two things from an orchestral standpoint. One is his use of timpani being the heartbeat. Again, it's an instrument that has a melodic content. I'm not saying no one ever did it before him, but he really involves the timpani there and in other places throughout the concerto as a solo instrument. It's that heartbeat happens as a line, which is just incredible. And then you were just playing how he changes that, whereas it's a rising dum bum 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 bum. Yeah, and that leads us right into the second movement, which is the first gesture is that rising to the second, right? So you have that lift, and then the Hungarian rondo. What do we hear? But two notes, one that rises to the next one. So, I mean, that's so, it's so much fun to see that and to realize it, and it's instantly hearable, but it doesn't bring to mind. He's just a genius at, you're not thinking, oh my gosh, he's using the same motive of the first two gestures in the second movement, now changing it to a Hungarian dance or a minor gypsy dance or something like that. But that's the miracle of Beethoven. So, and playing it as he's a pianist, a revolutionary pianist too, wasn't he really?
And this piece has what I would say the kitchen sink pianistically, with tons of bravura and virtuosity. And the cadenza that he wrote is insanely difficult and wonderful, and delves psychologically deeper into the fabric of the piece, and just gives that first movement so much deepening complexity. I would say it's such an incredible cadenza, and yeah, throughout the piano part is revolutionary, and not only for these pedal markings, but the way that he takes use of the full range of the instrument, the way that he really made it much more of an outgoing instrument than had been done before. I mean, right from when the pianist first enters, you hear this 4-minute orchestral introduction of where you hear pretty much all of the themes in the first movement, and then the pianist doesn't just enter the way the orchestra starts. He could have done that, but instead the pianist comes in with even more. He takes it to another level of putting the piano against the orchestra. It's a conversational tool. Yes. to say, here I am, let me have it's my turn.
Absolutely.
And yes. That's essence of Beethoven.
And declamatory, very much like what you've put into your concerto. Here I am. Here is this voice now has joined. One of the audacious things in Beethoven's concerto is that the second movement's in E major, which has absolutely nothing really to do with C minor at all. And yet, wow. I mean, I'm not, again, it's not that no one ever did that. It's just that it is both jarring and refreshing and right. Isn't that crazy? Because C minor, you have E flats, my favorite notes, E flats, A flats, I love them. but E natural, wow, E major, G sharps, there's your A flat. But you know what I mean? It's there, but it's kind of audacious for him. Do you do things, was that something that you thought about for your concerto in any kind of harmonic way, or were you more motivically oriented in what you were doing? Or
definitely. I mean, the concept of like tonality is a big thing I think about. And of course, what you were saying about the E major in the Beethoven is it's so striking. After the ear gets used to these pretty much C minor world key for the first movement, that's how the first movement sort of ends on that. And then the other end of the world, of the universe.
Yes, it's just so.
Even just that one chord is such a, you don't need to do anything else, and he grabs you with that,
Absolutely.
with
Yeah.
that one. So it's this ability that he has to play with ends of the world, or create a new world, perhaps, if you want to, however you want to look at it. But, and that is so, it strikes me every time. It's something I think I took for granted when I was getting to know this piece. Or if you don't just appreciate how revolutionary, how beautiful, and how striking that is. It's striking on the other end of the spectrum, I think. And
it really is. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I can't wait to play it.
Yeah. Well, we can't wait to be working with you and to perform with you. Our audiences have two wonderful, wonderful gifts musically to encounter on our performances. Gosh, I'm just looking forward to it so much. Two of my favorite people, Beethoven and Michael Brown. So thank you so much for joining us for this prelude. And we'll see you at the Maryland Theater. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye-bye.